Thank you, Hope, and thank you all for joining us for this TMC seminar. We are delighted this week to have with us a colleague. Susan Eastman is an emeritus professor here at the Divinity School who has taught and her scholarship has focused at the intersection of Paul's theological anthropology and contemporary issues in the care of persons, including prominently the care of persons in healthcare. Her work is informed by scholarly writing on the New Testament, as well as her own pastoral experience as an Episcopal priest in parishes around the country. And her publications include Paul and the Person, Reframing Paul's Anthropology, as well as Oneself in Another, Participation and Personhood in Paul's Theology and Romans. She's just been a terrific friend to TMC and to TMC's students over the years, has been a mentor and teacher and really someone who's helped us think about the significance of Paul's account of being human for the work of healthcare. So I'm delighted to welcome her today for the intriguing talk title, Christian Flourishing and Reimagining Healthcare, An End to Magical Thinking. And just one last reminder to all of you, as you have questions throughout, please use the Q&A function to submit those, and we will have Dr. Eastman address as many as we can at the end of her initial talk. Susan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Far. It's just a treat and an honor to be here. As you know, I'm a huge fan of what TMC does. I think that the conversations that happen here are crucial, not only for medicine, but for thinking theologically, mutually nourishing. So thank you for the warm welcome back. I speak today as a fellow traveler, encountering the mystery of human suffering and flourishing, which I will say, from the practice and perspective of faith, are not mutually exclusive. I'm aware that so many others, including others here, are doing such important work around these mysteries. And so all I'm going to do is offer some thoughts, another angle of vision into this rich, ongoing conversation. So to begin, my topic is the way a faith-based account of human flourishing may act as an antidote to the dangers of what I call magical thinking in healthcare. Now, by magical thinking, I mean if-then thinking pushed to its limits as a way to try to get some certainty and control in the face of great unknowns. And by a faith-based account of human flourishing, I mean because-therefore thinking that starts from the because of God's power and will for the redemption of all, and therefore encompasses all human experience, not only what fits within limited depictions of flourishing, all human experience within the holding environment of God's favor and redemption. So I start with the if-then thinking. Now that's what science does. That's how it works. And there are good reasons for that. If-then thinking is always at work in the interplay between cause and effect, and in health between diagnosis and treatment in a two-directional way. We might start with a set of symptoms and we look for the cause, the diagnosis. And if we isolate a cause, then a course of treatment may become available, which in turn leads to risk assessment, predictions about outcomes. And if we do this, hopefully, if we do this correctly, hopefully the desired outcomes will happen. This is a form of prediction, well known that it's flawed. It's a way to assert a degree of control and to try to manipulate cause and effect to achieve desired outcomes as much as possible. And it's based on statistical analyses. This is called evidence-based medicine. It's what Duke does. It's basic to medical research as well as treatment. And I'm grateful for it. It's very helpful. It's a valuable tool for determining and delivering healthcare. And it has its limits, the mysteries that elude its grasp, because there is always so much more going on than meets the eye or even shows up in test results. We can know statistics, but statistics aren't individuals. We can project the future based on consistent past results, in the majority of cases. Such if-then thinking becomes magical thinking when it is pushed to its limits, when it assumes a degree of control and power that simply does not exist in the complex, messy realities of human existence, human lives. Thus, if-then magical thinking constantly comes up against two limits. First, the uniqueness and mystery of every human person within themselves, their bodies, their histories, their life situations and relationships, all of which are intertwined and interactive and affect everything. This mystery extends beyond the patient to everyone in the room, including family, friends, and clinicians themselves. And it includes what German sociologist Hartmut Rosa calls, I love this phrase, the uncontrollability of the world. Rosa talks about the attempt to control an uncontrollable world as the modern project, and he notices how that attempt to control excludes wonder. And that leads to the second limitation of if-then thinking in regard to flourishing, and that is the fact of death. I will never forget an oncologist saying to me, "I like to fix things, and I can't fix this." And I appreciated his honesty. Now, the dangers of if-then thinking are fairly obvious, at least some of them. First, diagnoses can become labels that presume to explain the unexplainable. They're useful for plotting a course of treatment, and at the same time, sometimes they completely miss the very particular hidden relational, historical, environmental factors involved in a person's illness or complicating treatment. Second, because the assumption and goal of this kind of thinking is that we are, or at least should be, in control, the other side of if-then thinking is if only, for both clinicians and patients and their families or friends. If only we had gotten the diagnosis sooner. If only I hadn't missed that aberration on the scan. If only I had done radiation instead of chemo. If only I had reconciled with my son before he died. If only I could pray more or believe more or pray harder. If only. We are unable to come to terms with the limitations of medicine and the limitations of ourselves in if-then thinking. And that's a real factor in burnout because we always should have been able to do more. That's always the case. And so this if-then thinking, this presumption of control, leaves guilt and regret in its wake, not always, but often, when things don't turn out the way they're quote unquote supposed to, or when the conditions and capacities, implicit, assumed, necessary for achieving a desired outcome are simply impossible for any number of reasons beyond our control. Third, the mysterious quality of existence itself complicates the interplay between diagnosis and treatment. A failure to reckon with mystery, with uncertainty, has a tendency to reduce situations and people and a vision of the good, of good outcomes, of flourishing, to what we can, or think we can, control. For example, a good death is often narrated as a death in which the patient writes the script to the very end. When it is not possible for clinicians to fix the problem is that the temptation is to drop the patient, because the patient becomes a problem to be fixed or a puzzle to be solved. And it's very difficult to engage with patients who are not fixable or solvable. There was a recent op-ed in the New York Times by a physician named Daniela Lamas called, quote, "The terrifying realization that a patient is still in there." She writes, "A provocative large study published last year in the New England Journal of Medicine suggests that at least 1 in 4 people who appear unresponsive actually are conscious enough to understand language." As a doctor who sometimes sees patients like this, these findings are, in a word, terrifying. Studies like this raise the possibility that there are tens of thousands of men and women locked inside their own minds, isolated to a degree that I cannot even imagine. They are voiceless and largely invisible, with some of them being cared for in nursing facilities. There are a handful of researchers and a few institutions working to identify these patients and develop tools they can use to communicate. A lack of resources is one major barrier, and a larger one is philosophical. She concludes, the way many doctors think about these patients reflects the medical system's inability to deal with uncertainty and even what kind of life we believe to be worth living. Close quote. Now, what does flourishing look like in this context? That is, in the face of uncertainty, mystery, and finality. I suggest that from the standpoint of God's faithful, unconditional, powerful commitment to the salvation of all creation, the line between flourishing and suffering becomes vanishingly thin. Faith, that is, an account of God's faithfulness, encloses suffering and quote-unquote failure within flourishing. And this yields a stunning, radically capacious picture of the good, in which all things are taken up into God's purposes. That doesn't mean all things are good, but all things are taken up into God's purposes. Because we are not in control, we are part of something so much greater than we are. Such a picture shifts the focus from human failure and folly, as well as achievement and success, to the presence of the God who is Lord of life and death. This yields a radically countercultural picture of flourishing that begins with the revelation of God's unstoppable election and faithfulness in the history of Israel, and the incarnation of that divine faithfulness in Jesus Christ, crucified and resurrected Lord. I call this because, therefore, thinking, because God has established this underlying and ultimate and encompassing reality that is countercultural to the perceived status quo, therefore we may and must approach issues of human suffering and flourishing in a new way. So how might we imagine this shift in perspective? I'm going to begin by offering 3 examples from scripture and from art of this countercultural picture that focuses on God's faithfulness. So first, to begin at the beginning, let's start with Genesis. Marilyn Robinson recently published a book called Reading Genesis. I recommend it highly. It retells and ponders the stories of the human beings called by God in Genesis: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Abraham's extensive and deeply dysfunctional family tree, including Jacob and his many sons. Robinson notes 2 storylines running through the entire text. First, the meticulously detailed stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs that do not leave out any heinous act imaginable: murder, rape, fratricide, duplicity. She says, and then second, this narrative of God's unending, persistent faithfulness to these very imperfect people. She says, I've dwelt on this sequence of stories, one after another, exploring the ways in which the faithfulness of God is manifest in the world of fallen humanity. This kind of interpretation may seem ingenious and a little more if there were not essential truths lying behind it. The first of these is that these divine likenesses among whom we live, that is, all the other people, are of the highest interest and value to God. And the second is that we do not know how to judge and where to blame, because events are working themselves out at another scale and toward other purposes more than we can begin to grasp. Robinson then illustrates these claims by lingering over the story of Jacob and his many sons. Jacob's favoring of the youngest, Joseph, we know these stories. The fratricidal jealousy of Joseph's brothers, who throw him in a pit, stand by and watch when Joseph is sold into slavery, then sacrifice a goat so they can use the blood to smear on Joseph's coat, take it back to their father, and tell him the lie that Joseph was killed by a wild animal. Robinson lingers over the dynamics in this family, the years of duplicity in which all the brothers know and guard this secret of what they have done, living a lie. And the father, Jacob, who knows, because he did it himself, the sons deceive their fathers. And he knows his sons and that they are murderous. They have murderous impulses. And so he must distrust them. He must suspect them, but he dares not ask the question because he can't face the answer. And yet, through what the sons have done to Joseph, Joseph ends up in Egypt and becomes in a position of power where he is able to save this dysfunctional family that is God's beloved family, chosen family, from famine, so that they continue on into this unimaginable future. None of this undoes the egregiousness of what the sons have done, or the sickness in the family. Nor do the human actors have a clue as to the point and the larger import and results of their actions. They are mysteries to each other and even to themselves, and the meaning of their lives is in God's action in and through them, although they don't know this. It is a gift that has nothing to do with their worth. Robinson ponders this insoluble paradox in mystery. She says with great compassion and brutal honesty, this family of whom it is uniquely true that they are chosen by God to carry forward his will for humankind must be as unhappy as any family could be. When we consider what the favor of God can look like, Jacob and his sons should surely be borne in mind. This is not to say that God's favor causes their misery, but that despite and even through their misery and wrong, God's favor remains. God does not abandon them, and they do not fall out of God's purposes. Robinson is highlighting two humanly incommensurable narratives as they run through Genesis. One is the narrative of human risk, wrongdoing, moments of achievement, failure, complexity, all of life in its terrible messiness and contingency. And the other is God's favor, presence, and purposes, largely invisible, always active. In that narrative, flourishing, that is the outworking of God's redemptive presence and will, becomes shockingly inclusive. Nothing is excluded from that presence and will. Robinson calls this grace. Now, the second counterculture picture of flourishing depicts God's incarnate presence in and through our broken humanity. And here we turn to some pictures from the Pope's private chapel in the Vatican. And Parker, you can cue up the first one. This chapel is called the Pauline Chapel, and I was privileged to be part of a private tour there. And there are two huge frescoes, the last frescoes Michelangelo ever painted, on either side of the chapel on the opposing walls. On the left is Paul. Here he is. He's blinded. He can't see a thing. His arm is thrown up to shield himself from the terrifying light that perhaps feels like a blow that is coming down from heaven. Paul has been knocked off his horse. He's bewildered. He's in the dark. He's wondering what's happening to him, and he doesn't know what the future holds. This is how people feel when they get a terrifying prognosis. And Paul, it turns out, has gotten a terrifying prognosis. Because on the other side of the chapel is Peter. There's Peter being nailed to the cross upside down, as tradition has it. And Peter's eyes are wide open. You can see that. He's glaring. He's looking over his shoulder, glaring across the nave. And what is he looking at? He's looking at Paul. That's what the abbot who took me on this tour said. He imagines that Peter is saying to Paul, this is what you have to look forward to. Now, the worshiper in the pew sits between these two depictions of Christian experience. And the worshiper faces ahead to a crucifix on the high altar. And there it is. And the crucifix is, of course, Jesus abandoned, as near as Jesus knows, on the cross. But behind that crucifix is this image of ascension life, resurrection life. Now, this is the because that frames all therefores. This is, from the perspective of Christian faith, the reality encompassing every other experience in the life of faith. This is what the worshiper is surrounded by and held by? And how might this change our imagination about flourishing? We might start by noticing that neither Peter nor Paul nor even Jesus is at this point the one who is in charge of their death or their life. They are not the heroes of their own stories. They are not in control. They are in places that, from the viewpoint of their own culture, are meaningless, powerless, terrible, heinous, hopeless, abandoned by God. We remember what Jesus said to Peter, "You will be bound and taken where you do not want to go." We remember what Jesus cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And at the same time, the very encompassing images tell us that God is with us and with them in this reality. These images depict a picture of God's presence that does not exclude the experience of thousands of people, including thousands of people of faith, including Peter, Paul, and Jesus himself. Surely a faithful account of flourishing must be radically different, radically capacious, including what must seem like incommensurable realities, the radical hope of resurrection and present suffering and death. And that brings me to my third illustration of a faithful imagination in relationship to flourishing. And that is, no surprises here for those who know me, the Apostle Paul and the writings of Paul. Early in his second letter to the Corinthian believers, Paul stresses his own experiences of affliction. He stresses it. I want you to know, he says, what we endured in Asia. And he goes on to say we almost despaired of life itself. Later, he gives a highly paradoxical account of his experience of death and life. And this is 2 Corinthians 4, 6 through 11. He says, it is the God who said, let light shine out of darkness, the Creator God, who has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars to show that the transcendent power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh. This is remarkable. Here, both physical and emotional anguish become a medium of revelation of life itself. This is not logical, it is not controllable, it is not predictable, but I suspect some of us can tell stories of people we know who have demonstrated this paradoxical mix of affliction and hope. This is a radically countercultural picture of flourishing as a way of life. It includes experiences that seem opposed to flourishing in a human sense: affliction, perplexity, pain. What is striking is that in Paul's telling, for Jesus' life to be made visible in his mortal body, his solidarity with Jesus' death is also necessary. His suffering is the medium in and through which Christ's life is revealed. This is not to say that Paul sought out suffering or glorified in it, or that suffering is a good in and of itself, not so. But that as Paul encountered what looked like shame and failure in his cultural context, he reframed it in solidarity with Jesus. Or rather, perhaps he discovered the presence of Christ journeying with him right in the midst of his own perplexity, unknowing, uncertainty, and hardships. His experience is held by and inhabited by the crucified and risen Lord. Once again, to get at how countercultural this picture is, here's a line from an old hymn. This is not unusual in hymns. Here's how it goes. Monarch of all things, fit us for your mansions, banish our weakness, health and wholeness sending. A good prayer. And here's Paul speaking about his own prayer to be delivered from a mysterious thorn in the flesh. 3 times I asked the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. I will all the more gladly boast of my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. None of this, again, is to say that we should not pray for healing. Paul did. And seek in every way to alleviate suffering and extend life where possible. Nor is it to deny that the hope of resurrection life gives strength to endure afflictions in the present. Rather, it is to reframe those prayers and works of healing within the larger narrative of divine providence and surrender to God's will. And Paul puts this most clearly in Romans 8:28 and following, where he says, God causes all things to work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to God's purposes. We might pause and remember that those called according to God's purposes include Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and his very messed up sons and Joseph and all the rest. Those whom are called according to God's purposes, whom God foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. So let us note what this good looks like. It looks like being conformed to the image of Christ. It does not look like being in control of one's life or getting what we want or think we want. It looks like being conformed to the image of Christ, discovering that we belong not to ourselves, but to Christ, and through Christ to one another. This is a picture of flourishing. Now, because God in Christ redeems all things, therefore, even in situations that humanly speaking lead to despair, God is at work. This does not mean we have a la-la land Pollyanna approach to life, which would be truly terrible, a kind of magical thinking that silence is suffering. No, it creates the room to name doubt, name despair, name anger towards God, because they are no barrier to being held by God. In fact, they are held by God. So when we return to the halls of medicine, how do we see these paradoxical pictures of flourishing and suffering in play? That parallel but incommensurable narratives of human action and divine providence. Because as we recall, the medical system is not set up for uncertainty or mystery. How could it be? But running parallel to the whole narrative of cause and effect, we have an unseen presence in every room and corridor, the narrative of mystery, the whys and wherefores that cannot be sussed out by diagnostic tests, that require sitting with unknowing and endless curiosity and openness to the mystery of each person, which includes the mysteries of ourselves and each family system and environmental set of influences. Modern medicine does not have room or time for that mystery, but patients and their families and medical professions still live in it and have to live with it. So between these two narratives hover questions about flourishing and suffering. What might it look like to live in both realities at once as healthcare practitioners and patients, to live with both magic and mystery? How might we ponder this? So as a fellow traveler, I offer 3 takeaways for our discussion. The first is an epistemological takeaway. One response to this question is to cultivate a kind of bifocal vision. Now, this term bifocal vision comes from J. Lewis Martin, who was a truly great New Testament scholar and also a personal mentor. And he coined this term, bifocal vision, to describe an apocalyptic way of seeing that sees both what is far off and what is near at hand simultaneously, that sees God's inbreaking into the world now and God's final victory over sin and death, ultimately, and simultaneously engages in the realities of our daily lives. For my purposes here, that apocalyptic bifocal vision might include seeing both the patient and the unseen presence in the room, so to speak. Ideally, this leads to a kind of epistemic humility. It opens up different kinds of questions. What do I mean by that? Well, here's an example. In the face of a negative diagnosis, there are 2 kinds of questions that arise. The first set, which is where medicine excels, and this is very important, I value this, in the realm of cause and effect, diagnosis and treatment, is that questions that seek as much certainty as possible through giving information. The clinician tells the patient, sometimes family members or friends, facts about their bodies, statistics about treatment options, possible and probable outcomes of different options, and risk assessments. There's a definite aspect of compassionate care in this giving of information. It's attending to and acknowledging the fear of the unknown, attempting to provide as much knowledge and certainty as possible while knowing we cannot truly provide certainty, and trying to temper unrealistic expectations. This entails managing the unknown and all the backstories that shape the telling and receiving of difficult news for both caregivers and patients. This is a way of involving patients and those who love them in decision-making. That's the first set of questions. There is another set of questions that arises sometimes gradually, sometimes immediately, but often gradually and often from patients or their friends. These are the questions. What is God doing in this situation? Where might this lead in a life that always ultimately ends in death, and in light of the hope for some that death is not the end? Where might this process of diagnosis and treatment lead? What might come of it? What might be results we can't anticipate, not only for the patient, but for the larger circle of people involved in this life? This is part of the journey. It's a very hopeful kind of question. It opens up different ways of thinking and imagining. Many of us knew and journeyed with our colleague Richard Hayes in his amazing journey with pancreatic cancer. And we shared that journey. And in the New York Times obituary, there was a quote from Richard that I think really sums this up. Talked about his own grief at his initial diagnosis, and then the process he went through. And what he said about that is, I moved through the grief into a mindset of opening my hands to God. I moved through the grief into a mindset of opening my hands to God. This is the opposite of holding on to control. It is the fundamental movement of faith, which is surrender to God. Care providers very rarely have the time or space to linger with their patients over these questions, unfortunately. The point I want to make here, quite simply, is that God has all the time and space in the world, and is always present in ways that providers and family members cannot be. Furthermore, healthcare professionals do not stand outside this same framework of divine providence and care in every situation. They, you, are in the game, also held by the mystery of God's purpose and working, so that the question, what might God do in and through this situation, applies to clinicians, to caregivers, as well as to patients and their families. This divine presence in action, by the way, is in no way dependent on human belief or lack thereof. God has a tendency to show up in the most unexpected ways. The second takeaway is for clinicians. I'll try to be brief about that. It's moving from the position of being the one with the answers to being a fellow traveler. And in this, I really point all of us to the work that Warren Kinghorn has done on this in the imagery of being a wayfarer. I think that's incredibly valuable, helpful imagery. The image that comes to my mind is that of shifting positions. In a consultation, a medical consultation, the doctor and patient face each other. Ideally, there's eye contact. There's a lot of talk about this and how important this recognition, this seeing and being seen is, and I completely agree with that. There comes also a moment when the clinician may come and sit next to the patient, maybe to look at a computer screen, and say, let's look at this together. I want to offer this shift of positions as a metaphor for a larger shift that takes place. It's what in developmental psychology is called joint attention, when instead of the baby and parent looking at each other, they look together at a third object. The baby becomes aware of following the gaze of the parent. And in that, a different kind of bond is formed, the bond of sharing attention to something other than the self or each other. And I suggest that there's something like this that can happen in medicine, where the patient, family members, healthcare workers, together are looking at something other, looking at the future that is somewhat predictable, but radically unpredictable. And this shared attention to that which is beyond, this shift in relationship can create a different kind of bond that becomes increasingly collaborative in diagnosis and in treatment. And the clinician faces the questions of suffering and mortality and meaning along with the patient. This is a huge privilege. It can be a great gift. The third takeaway is the theological basis of everything else I've said here. Both those who offer care and those who receive it are accompanied by God. God is journeying with every person in the room, regardless of whether or what they believe. There are many stories of a sense of God's presence showing up for people who have never professed faith. God is in no way limited by or determined by our actions, our capacities, our conditions, or anything else. Because God in Christ has entered into the place of affliction, failure, and death, even the place of meaninglessness and abandonment. Therefore, nothing is outside God's providential care. This is the capacious, radically inclusive vision of flourishing that arises from the standpoint of faith. That is, God's faithfulness creates a holding environment in which nothing is lost, but everything, misjudgments, failures, weaknesses, successful surgeries, faithlessness, is
That's
redeemed.
encouraging.
This is off like
There's
next
somebody
week.
else coming
Yeah,
in on the
but it'll
voice.
change.
And then, yeah, and then she also has
Maybe someone needs to turn off
time after
their voice.
afternoon too, some openings. So
Okay,
Hang on,
that's-
Susan. Let me find
That's
them
the
and I'll,
base what I
I'll mute
wanted
them.
to
Hang
know,
on.
so everything else just don't
That's
worry about it. I was gonna say,
I'll find them.
I got it.
somebody-
Okay. It turns out that all kinds of lives are worth living. That this is the bottom line of a faithful imagination, of flourishing, therefore reimagining medicine, the presence of God in every situation. I'm just going to briefly sum up. I know our time will be limited. This bifocal apocalyptic imagination removes the practices of healthcare from the delusion that we can ultimately manipulate reality or even ourselves or relationships. It is able to acknowledge the ways we cannot control ultimate outcomes. It shifts the focus from our capacities and conditions to God's presence. It doesn't mean that what we do doesn't matter. It just means there's more at work in the room. And it removes these questions of flourishing from if-then thinking into deepening awareness of the presence of God. And just maybe this can help in dealing with the inevitable if-onlys and regrets that come from if-then thinking. Just maybe it can help us develop new ways of hope. Because if we're back in that Pauline chapel between Paul's bewilderment, Peter's suffering, Christ on the cross, and behind him, resurrection life, in that place, neither hubris nor regret have any place. They're just irrelevant. So that's my hope, that this apocalyptic bifocal vision can be a necessary and welcome limitation on the goals and tasks of medicine, maybe an antidote to burnout, and maybe a way of hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. I will just say, as one of the TMC faculty, I think your talk, better perhaps than any of we TMC core faculty could do, really is a picture of what we hope the TMC does, bringing the richness of the story of salvation and the story that we've received and we're a part of, and the people we're a part of, to bear to help us see the world that we inhabit and see the ways that we're invited to live in it that maybe they're hard to see sometimes in the world. So just thank you so much. It was really terrific. I want to begin with a question going back to your first story as you went back to Jacob and his sons. And that is, if you would just speak as a pastor to kind of your pastoral approach, because it seems to me on the one hand, what you've talked about can be the way we can be patterned can be an expression of our being given over to idols that are in our world, and something like a kind of prophetic calling to turn our eyes away from this magical thinking could be there. And also, I think about as the story of Israel makes clear, it seems how susceptible we always are to to seeing our circumstances as a sign that God has abandoned us. And we see that in the story there, the Jacob and his sons, and them after them, thinking, God, what in the heck are you doing? Your thoughts on that as a pastor?
Yeah. Well, for me, reading Marilyn Robinson's book, which it's a slow burn, you get into it slowly, and then it becomes very quietly, very humbly and austerely, extremely powerful. It's a kind of hope, a humble hope that no matter how bad it is, God is present and at work. It's very simple. It's not complicated. I think there is a kind of if-then thinking that's very prevalent in Christian practice and really doesn't have any support in Scripture, but it's so tempting because we want it. We want to have some sense that, well, if we do this, we can be sure that this will happen in an uncontrollable world. And so it's very seductive and it's very prevalent. And it leads to great guilt because, of course, we always fail. We always mess up. So I think that these stories, just like the cross itself, are antidotes to that kind of thinking that demonstrate God always active in the family that can't fit the conditions of flourishing for one reason or another, because of its family history, because of ingrown dynamics, because of addictions, because of sickness, because of jealousies. All the stuff is no barrier to God. God is already always present. That's just the simple takeaway, but it's profound. And of course, how does that work out pastorally? Well, it often works out by the pastor or other Christians being present. And sometimes God shows up the most unexpected ways that are not within the community of faith sometimes. Those are some thoughts about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to put a question that someone offered here. A strong sense of responsibility for our patients' outcomes is baked into us in medical training, which surely has benefit. Medical systems with no sense of responsibility are generally not awesome. But in the realm of responsibility, our training tends not to consider God's sovereignty in the life and death of our patients. Do you think the because therefore pattern resonates with living into the mystery of God's sovereignty and our own free will in understanding the outcomes of our patients? I think I know the answer to that, but just any other thoughts from you?
I'd like to hear your answer, Far.
I think you'd say yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Because
The question is
God
what that
is,
looks like.
yeah, because of who God is, what God has done, therefore we can act, I heard you say, we can act without the pretense or the need or the anxious desire to make sure that we get everything right. We can act freely in all of our human brokenness and limitations.
Yeah, that's all we can do. That's reality. That's all we can do. So it gives us this freedom to be honest about our limits, which I think must be crucial for medical practitioners because burnout's pretty high. And that means, for example, that when we cannot, because of time limitations, because of the medical system, because there's always another patient, we cannot be with and for the patients we want to be with and for. And that's not an ideal system, but that's often what we live with. I'm trying to think about living with the realities of things as they are. We have to be able to let that go into God's care. And that doesn't mean we don't try to do everything we can. It means we can just live with what we can't do. And that seems to me to be absolutely necessary for being able to survive and thrive.
It prompts me a brief question, which is this: praying with patients. Some people would say that's the last thing you want to do before you say take them under your intensive treatment. I mean, it seems to suggest, is it that bad? You're praying for me? It's that bad, doc? But obviously, praying for a patient or with a patient could seem to be a practice of aligning your vision outward, like you were talking about. Thoughts about that?
Well, I would invite the thoughts from people in this Zoom room, because it seems to me that is kind of a judgment call, isn't it? I mean, when you make that decision, well, you're listening with those antenna up, to the people you're with, to what you know of where they are and who they are, and to God. And it's a judgment call. And sometimes it seems like a good judgment call, sometimes it doesn't. But I mean, really, we kind of live, that's kind of the mystery that we live in. And in some situations, they will say, thank you so much. And in some situations, it's like, whoa, no, back off. I don't think, I just think that asking the question shows the sensitivity to each situation and each person in context.
Yeah, I'll just comment, because it's been something that's frequently been asked to me over the years, that we observe that doctors have internalized, it's probably one symptom of the if-then magical dominance of that way of thinking, but we've internalized the sense that to cross over and interact with patients about religious or spiritual concerns, dimensions of their experience, of their being human, of what's at stake, and is dangerous, like a third rail, like a crossing a boundary that maybe in some circumstances you could cross really quickly and jump back, but it's generally to be avoided. And yet, when people do that, they tend to report that they feel like they're coming alive, and that this is an experience of that most a kind of thrilling experience of actually connecting with a patient in a real way about the reality of their shared human experience. I say that it does seem to require that kind of judgment that you talked about, prudential judgment and wisdom developed over time, but the recognizing our human limitations and God's the because therefore that's behind it. There seems like there's got to be an openness to that in our interactions with human beings, because that's reality.
Yeah, thank you. And that can be done through the open-ended question.
It can.
The open-ended question, which is just really interested in how you see it spiritually, what you think and feel about this spiritually. You may or may not want to talk about that, but the door is open, Yeah, thank you.
Let me put to you another question that one of our participants has offered. What practices or disciplines do you suggest to retrain us to live with mystery and uncertainty, or maybe to retrain us in that because therefore way of thinking and living?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of like we're putting ourselves in the place, we're allowing ourselves to acknowledge the mystery. Here's the trick about it. I mean, there are many, I think, disciplines that help reframe our imagination that way. I mean, reading the stories of Genesis might do that, for example. And worship can do that. Christian fellowship, praying with others in safe places. All of these are ways in which that can happen so that our imaginations are reshaped. And I just hesitate that not to begin to think about that in a formulaic if-then kind of way. That's always the trick, Any Christian practice is not, I don't want it to become a formula that then if you do this, well, then But at the same time, it's a way of placing ourselves, allowing ourselves to be in a place where our imaginations can be reshaped. And I think all of those practices can be helpful in that, because our imagination needs to be filled with waiting for God. I sometimes think about this as waiting, medicine is full of waiting, especially for patients, terrible waiting. And when you're waiting for the unknown, your imagination will fill it with all kinds of things, not always helpful. But if I can conceptualize waiting in every situation, this is hard to do, as waiting for God, then that redirects my thinking about it. It redirects my imagination.
Mhm.
What's God going to do here? That's just one little story of how our imaginations get reframed. But I do think that scripture, sharing stories of faith can help with that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, it's terrific. Another question, you began to touch on this, but say a bit more. One of our participants asked, I'm wondering, as a hospice chaplain, where lament comes into this picture. If we believe that all things are brought up into God's purposes, is there room for patients and their families and clinicians to lament?
Yes, of course. There has to be. That's part of what I want, in a way, what I want to say about this because, therefore. I mean, the because is all about God's action, God's reliability, the capaciousness of God's working for good. Therefore, we can say anything.
Yeah.
Just that. Therefore, we can lament, and we may indeed need to lament. Lament is an expression of trust, even when it's anger. And what are you doing, God? It's still a relational expression. And so I just want to say that that the basis, the reason there is room for lament is because it will not cut us off from God. We can express abandonment. The Psalms are full of this.
We can falsely accuse God.
Yes, we can falsely accuse God. We can say anything. God is not dependent on what we say or don't say. And God
I just have to say, I think of how powerfully this comes. I mean, I've seen it many, many times in the clinical context. The contrast between that and someone desperately trying to keep the right attitude,
yeah,
the right positiveness, the right affirmation that God is going to ultimately heal this person, and the way that just becomes, power. It seems powerfully governed by fear that they're not going to do that adequately, and that as a result, the outcome is not going to come about that they hope.
exactly. Yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
Mm.
That's the magical thinking that is terrible for people, disguised as faith. Yeah.
Another question, in light of the mysteries of being human, how can one consider a step towards shaping economic forces and policies or even other forces accordingly on the healthcare system that rely on if-then thinking? There's a challenging question for you.
I thought about this and I thought, that's another conversation. There are other people better. It's a very important conversation about reshaping healthcare itself. I think that's utterly crucial. And the laments about all the reasons healthcare does not function well for people's well-being. And I thought about that, but I thought, I'm kind of interested in what might speak to people within the limits that we, realistically within the limits of where we are, without saying they shouldn't be challenged and changed. But I will say that's in a way beyond my pay grade and in a way outside of the ambit of this conversation. But I know there are other people who are working on this really and really strongly and importantly.
I'm going to say, I suspect it would be congruent with what you've just taught us about, that those who are in a position to have some influence on such things likewise can act with freedom, trusting that if they get crushed by the wheel, or if they fail, or if, yet God will somehow be with them and take things up into his good purposes.
Yes, there's always the and so, and then the story is never over. You
Mm.
may have your part in this process of trying to change unjust systems of healthcare, for example, and you may experience setbacks and failure, but you're not the only one in the game. And God is still at work and can take everything up and keep it going. That's part of that big picture, I think, of providence. I'm picking up on what you've said and just kind of amplifying it a little bit. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm just going to comment for those of our alumni who've taken at least my course. We read this little book by the Orthodox French theologian Jean-Claude Larcher, who looks back at some of the Greek church fathers, and they're writing about health and medicine. And in there, Larcher, he kind of summarizes their account, which you've really beautifully described features of it, but as an invitation to the one who is sick to not merely, I think in your terms, turn to if-then kind of logic, which he says leads us to basically reject the experience of sickness as something that's just foreign. We just have to get rid of it, and therefore gives over power over our lives to people who promise to do that, whether it's the healthcare system or some preacher who's going to put you through a particular process so that God will answer, get what you want, and leads to fear and anxiety and shame and all those things. But instead to look to assume our illness, that was the language he used, which is not to say the illness is good, as you pointed out, and the church fathers were really keen to make sure they didn't say God was the author of illness, but is an affirmation that God will, and as you so beautifully invited us to remember, take even this will be the occasion somehow of God's good gifts. And therefore to kind of look with that posture of, Lord, where are you? Where are you in this?
Thank you. That's
Even
really
if I
good.
can't see you, and I
Yeah.
don't know for certain.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, friends, this was a really delightful session. Thank you, Dr. Eastman. Thank you all for your attention. Please join us again next time for the Theology, Medicine, and Culture seminar.
Thank you so much. Real pleasure to be here. Thank you.